Hi there, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Wendy Lower, the author of The Ravine, A Family, a Photograph, a Holocaust Massacre Revealed. She's a professor of history and the director of the Magrublian Center for Human Rights at Claremont McKenna College in California. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Lower.
Wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Before we start our interview, I do want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. This is an audio medium, but I'm going to try to describe a picture for you as best I can. Also, I'm going to post it on our Twitter profile the day that this episode is released, so you can take a look at it as you listen along to this episode. So this picture is in black and white. 5 uniformed men are standing around a woman who is bent over and holding the hand of a child to her left. 2 of those men in uniform have rifles pointed. One of them is firing in a cloud of dust directly at the woman's head. She is in the process of beginning to fall over and taking the child with her into a large pit that has been dug. There is some clothing on the ground around them, and the whole scene is surrounded by trees. You found this picture, Professor, in 2009. Where and how did you find the picture?
Well, it came to me, actually. I was in the archives of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in August 2009. So about 68 years, almost 70 years after the photograph was taken in October 1941. And I was actually at the museum doing research on a perpetrator who was still alive in Germany, living outside of Frankfurt. His name was Bernhard Frank. He was like the 3rd person down from Himmler. So he was one of the highest ranking SS officers still alive. And so I was with a team of people and we were digging through archives trying to find kind of a smoking gun, kind of find more evidence about his crimes. We were interviewing him. He was admitting certain things. So we were kind of building that case. And by the way, he was indicted, but he died in 2011 before the trial could actually take place. So as we were pursuing this perpetrator, I was at the microfilm reader going through SS records, and 2 journalists had arrived at the museum. It's typical in DC that people come in from the street, come from, different all over the world, actually, to bring things to the museum, to bring artifacts and photographs and objects, to find out more about them, and sometimes to donate these items to the collection. These 2 journalists had come from an institute in Prague that was studying the crimes of kind of totalitarianism. And they had uncovered this photograph in what was the former KGB archive in Prague. So it had not seen the light of day. It had not been researched. It was sitting there, had been part of an investigation against the photographer, but was not part of our kind of memory or part of our kind of public record, official record of the Holocaust. And I was immediately struck by it because, as you just described it, we have what is a kind of action shot. We have murder in process, genocide happening, the actual killing of a Jewish family. And it's a very vivid picture, a very stable picture that's composed carefully by the photographer, following kind of the rule of thirds, showing the landscape, showing the crime scene, showing the killers with their guns pointed, and the blast of the smoke. The halos of smoke are visible as well. And
there was
saw
a date
these.
On the,
yes,
I'm sorry. There was a date on the picture too.
They turned it over, and they knew that I had worked on Ukraine. That was my area of expertise, and that's why the archivist came up to me with the journalist and said, "Hey, Wendy, this was taken in Ukraine on October 13th, 1941, in a small town called Miropol, which is about 100 miles west of Kiev." And coincidentally, I had worked on that region on my dissertation, so I knew the records from that region fairly well, especially the German documents, and had traveled through that area as well. I knew the terrain. But the immediately striking part of the image was the Ukrainians shooting side by side with the Germans, shoulder to shoulder. And in my prior work, I had studied the Ukrainians as collaborators. Mostly they were guards at the camps, or they were escorting Jews to the killing sites in these forests and fields where they were shot about more than a million Jews shot in Ukraine. That's the local Ukrainians were very much a part of this. But there was a lot of resistance to the fact that Ukrainians also shot. Like, why would the Germans arm Ukrainians whom they considered to be inferior, kind of Untermenschen, as they call them? But here indeed was incontrovertible evidence that they were actually also shooting their Jewish neighbors.
What is amazing to me, and you described this early on in the book, is that of all the death that occurred in the Holocaust, millions of people, tens of millions of people, pictures of the death actually happening are few and far between. So much so that in your book, you actually count them and you run through them really quickly in like one paragraph, and you can put them on your fingers and toes. And that, as you described, was by design of the Nazis. Why did they understand, or I should say, what did they understand about how the proliferation of personal photography could slow down their efforts to exterminate the Jewish people?
These are the ironies of this history as far as what is the context, what's emerging in the 1930s and 40s, and then you have to kind of position that against this Nazi campaign of genocide, a state-sponsored campaign of genocide. So in the 1930s and 40s, we have the introduction of the portable camera, of the snapshot camera. It was the camera craze, the hobby photography was taking off. By 1939, 10% of the German population owned these cameras. Agfa, Zeiss Icon, of course, Kodak here in the United States. And the camera had been a very important tool, actually, in the history of genocide, going back to the genocide that occurred in the Congo in the late 19th century. That was documented with the camera. And King Leopold at that point was exposed by the camera. Mark Twain said that was his undoing the camera. So we know already that cameras were important not only for taking personal family photographs, but also in the pursuit of crimes and justice and criminal photography. So we have this interesting combination of ordinary people carrying cameras and having the potential to document these crimes in the way that we see in social media today. And the craze of purchasing and taking photos during the war, 15,000 photojournalists were embedded by Goebbels in the various theaters of the war and took about 3.5 million images of the war. So it was not only the most destructive war historically, but it was also the most photographed. And of course, we have our own record of the war in the Pacific, for instance, very iconic images.
But what is
so we have the
yeah? Well, I was just going to ask.
So
what
the
is
cameras
striking is that we've seen so many pictures of people lined up and of the train tracks and of what the trains looked like and of what the outsides of the gas chambers looked like and all these other things. The scenes of destruction in Europe, but we seldom. And I didn't know this till I read this, that we seldom see the picture of the actual death taking place. So how has that shaped our understanding of the Holocaust?
It's a great question. And there have been quite a few books on Holocaust photography, and cultural critics have been discussing this for decades. Susan Sontag and earlier Hannah Arendt talked about Holocaust images as an instant of truth. So a long, very interesting discussion that I refer to in my book. I don't get too deep into it, but the fact is that the body of material that we have, what we would call kind of Holocaust photographs, are mostly from liberation, taken in 1945 when the Allies liberated camps. So we see corpses, really horrific graphic scenes from Bergen-Belsen. We see survivors standing gaunt, before the gates of Dachau or in Mauthausen. And those photographs, don't show us. They show us dead victims and they show us emaciated survivors. We also have a lot of material from the Germans themselves. For instance, at Auschwitz-Birkenau, a very famous album that was created for the commandant that was a kind of professional practice among the Germans to create these photo albums for their superiors. Look what a great job I did, right? The clearing of the Warsaw Ghetto, the arrival of Jews at Birkenau, the selections in 1944. But they didn't want, obviously, documentation of the act of murder. That's the absolutely most incriminating kind of document. So we have victims kind of at their deportation sites, being marched to their deaths, but that actual moment of murder, we know there were photos taken. Himmler kept issuing orders, reintroducing the ban on taking such photos. We have documents in which he says, stop taking these photos, and they were systematically confiscated. Of course, after the war, the perpetrators or those who were witnesses that close up who took these photos then tried to destroy them or suppress them or hide them because they were so incriminating. So yes, it's true. We have among the kind of murder images, a relative handful, out of 100,000 that are digitized at the museum and available on the web, we have a dozen that we can that depict this actual act of murder. And of those, we don't know, like, who is the photographer, who is the person in the picture, where was this taken?
And how has the lack of pictures influenced our view of all this 75 years on now?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware, and there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
No. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Well, it does create that opening as far as anyone who might doubt or question what exactly happened when one was pushed into a gas chamber or when one was shoved to the edge of town and forced to stand at the pit or a ravine and shot. So these photos are important for establishing the truth, as Hannah Arendt stated about Holocaust photos, instant of truth. And that's important to uphold. We don't want any possibility. I mean, this is something that Eisenhower said when he liberated Ohrdruf. He was afraid that this history might be questioned, that it might be skewed as propaganda. And when I started on this journey in 2009, I could not have imagined the situation we're in today, where there is doubt about this history, where there is doubt and truth. We live in a kind of post-factual world. So I feel like this book is also kind of is important because it's reaffirming these very basic fundamental facts of what happened.
Tell us where the Holocaust is on October 13th, 1941, the day the picture is taken, and how those months became kind of a turning point as the Nazis begin to ramp up the killing machinery.
Absolutely. Those who have read the history and know that the summer of 41 was a turning point. It's an important chapter in the decision-making and Hitler's step and his instructions to his subordinates, especially to Himmler. So in the summer of 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Nazis viewed their conquering of the East as the titanic struggle, as the existential moment for its 1,000-year Reich, to defeat Judeo-Bolshevism in their ideology and their worldview was going to secure their future. And in fact, in the summer of 41, during this military conquest, what they called a war of destruction. So they already understood the war as not only a military campaign, but one that would combine conquest on the front with behind the lines in the occupation zones, mass destruction of the civilian population of so-called racial enemies and inferiors, starting with the Jews. So the Jews had already been ghettoized in Poland at this point when the war broke out in 1939, but now we're moving into the phase of going after the victims and hunting them down and shooting them outright, not death by, conditions in the ghetto through starvation and spread of disease, but now outright killing.
Before we get into the descriptions and what you were able to analyze from the pictures, I do want to just ask in general here, you see the killings that are depicted in this picture, or at least those types of killings, people were taken to the edge of town and shot, as being personal, that the victims may even know their executioners in the case of these pictures, and that these are in some ways vengeful killings because of the way these small towns work. So can you just talk a little bit about what we know about how these types of attacks developed?
Absolutely. I mean, you're clearly more than a student of this history. I really enjoying your questions. In the summer of 41, Hitler said to his ally, I find this is very kind of representative of this moment too, his ally, his Croatian ally, Marshal Kvetanek, he said that this campaign in the East will succeed when there is no Jewish family. He refers specifically to Jewish families left in Europe. Hitler was concerned that the children of the victims, that to go after the men, first of all, as the most threatening, the able-bodied men, but to not, if one didn't exterminate the entire population, then in the future, the children would rise up. And he mentioned this historically. He had his own sense of history as far as when Jews had been driven out of Europe, whether it was the 15th century expulsions from Spain or various episodes, he said they always come back. The children come back and avenge. So it was that kind of ferocity and that kind of determination, what they called the final solution, that crystallized in that momentous period in the summer. And the photo really speaks to that because, first of all, these are open air shootings. There's nothing secretive. There's nothing modern about it. It's not the gas chambers and kind of factory style killing that seems to provide the perpetrators with a sense of distance from the violence. These are very intimate kinds of experiences, to the extent that in the photo we see the German killer, who is firing his gun. He's got his arms kind of, looks like he's resting his hand on the shoulder of the woman, maybe kind of keeping her in place. The Ukrainian militia, as you mentioned, these were their neighbors. They knew some of them by name. And the fact that the killing of the family, which is the most intimate core unit of our existence, and so much of what makes us human, the love of family members, and that was to be completely, that's part of the dehumanization. That's part of the extreme cruelty on the part of the genocidaires, and then of course on the part of the victims. How did they experience that, right? The having to go to their deaths as a family unit like that. The added cruelty, the added sense of violation of what it is to be a human being is really, I think, clear in that image.
I do want to say to our listeners that I know this may not be the most comfortable episode to listen to, or the brightest and cheeriest episode that we've done here on this show. We've done episodes on the history of Seinfeld and on Mets baseball and things like that. But I just think this is a really important topic, and so I appreciate your listening along to it, because we have to understand that these are things that happened, and that the only way to stop them from happening again is to understand how they did and to understand what happened during them. So I appreciate your listening along to this sometimes difficult discussion. At what point, Doctor, do you decide that you must tell the entire story of this photograph and not let it remain on an island like so many of the photographs that we have around? They sit somewhere and then they just sit, and we forget the context of them. At what point did you decide you wouldn't let that happen with this photo, and why?
Well, really at the point of seeing it, because if you can imagine, as I pose these questions in my book, if you come across a photograph that depicts a murder scene, clearly an innocent family, you can't even impose anything on it. It's just what it is. You see it, whether it's happened in your lifetime, if the photo indicates that it's a contemporary photo or historical one. If one finds a photo of, the photographs we have of lynchings, for instance, and I don't know how much research has been done on those, and I hopefully as much as possible. I fear not. I see these photos, for instance, of lynchings in textbooks and so forth, and I don't see deep captions and I don't see deep studies on them. And they're in wide circulation, and they were in wide circulation at the time. They were turned into postcards. And yet, who are the people in the photos? What happened to them? And so there's an ethical moment where you see something like that as a human being. You're offended, you're appalled, you're shocked, you're disturbed, you're haunted. But at some point, you have to say, this needs to be uncovered. The facts need to be established here. The people who were in that photograph didn't get that justice, didn't get that. Or the depiction of them is not how they want to be depicted, obviously. So that's another ethical challenge. But perhaps in this case, I thought the perpetrators might even still be alive, because some of them were, one of them was young, was a minor. He was under 18 when he was shooting.
What did you find in Mirapool, and that is where the shooting happened? Tell us about this, and I don't. Tell us about this heroic search you went on, because I consider it heroic. You'll probably wave me down and go, no, but it's a heroic search that you go on to find all these different things that are associated with this photograph, starting with the place itself. So talk about Mirapool and where that fit into World War II and into the context of destruction of Judaism, and what you found when you went there decades and decades later.
Yeah, it is a story of discovery. The book is kind of a combination of, it's a little bit memoirish as far as the first person and the journey of discovery. I had a lot of help, so I don't feel as if this was, as you say, heroic. I work in a fabulous field of community of scholars. Holocaust research has taken off over the decades in the course of my lifetime. And one thing I really love about this field, not only do we support each other tremendously, but there's so much work to be done. We kind of, when we're at a place like the museum where the photo came in, people really gather around the table and they say, okay, can you find out about this? What about that? What do you know about that? There is true collaboration in the best sense of the word, because there's a shared sense of purpose and mission and passion about this, and trying to get the story right and trying to memorialize the victims and educate. So that ethos has sustained me, and it's also what propels the research and why this field, that we can do this research in this community of scholarship. Now, when I saw the photo, I thought about how much Holocaust studies had advanced a lot of methods of historical research in ways that maybe other scholarly communities had not. Scholars who worked on the French Revolution some decades ago, for instance, innovated different ways of looking at revolutionary theory and political culture and so forth. And as a graduate student, I was kind of trained on those kinds of advances. So I thought, well, maybe Holocaust studies we could kind of show readers what's possible as far as research in general, but specifically to the Holocaust. So when I looked at the photograph, I immediately thought, okay, the Nazi documents, the archival empirical record, the war crimes trials, the visual evidence here, the landscape. I picked apart the photograph like a puzzle and pulled out, the forensic archaeology piece would be on the landscape. So I need to go back to the crime scene and do that kind of detective work and talk to people who work in these kinds of investigations. I didn't understand why the smoke was taking that formation in the image, and contacted the FBI. I contacted people in the Attorney General's office in California and then ballistics experts and had them look at it and got their feedback. So it's kind of going around showing this to different people. And then I teamed up with Yehad and Unam, Father Desbois, who's been doing a lot of testimony collection in Ukraine. It's been featured in 60 Minutes and so forth. And I wanted to see his whole operation and kind of critique it in a way and participate in it. And so I said, let's go and go to Mirapool and see what we can collect as far as Ukrainian testimony, and go to the crime scene and tell me what you're finding as far as the landscape and the topography, and to what extent that mass grave has been disturbed, and can it be preserved in some way? Can it be marked and memorialized? So I started,
Well, I don't know how much you want to give away of the book, but I do want to ask, if you can just describe what it was like to find it and stand at this spot where, if you'd been standing there 75 years before, you would have seen something horrible or been the victim of something horrible.
Exactly. When we went to the actual spot, the first time I went by myself in 2014 with a friend, an interpreter who's from that region. And the second time I went in 2016 with Yehad and Unam. And the first time I went, I just had a drawing from the archival record and kind of retraced the steps of the victims from the center of town. And actually, there were 3 murder sites in Mirapool. And so the first time I went, I didn't find the site that was pictured in the photograph. I found the site where other victims had been shot. That was an actual ravine. And a local person there took me to that site. Her grandmother was in Mariupol during the war. I also discovered the history of Jews in Mariupol, which had been completely, not erased, but just, was in shards. Like the Jewish cemetery there was graffiti on it. It was a mess. There were booze bottles all over the place. The stones were trashed. When we went in 2016 and we found the actual site where the photograph was taken, and it was findable because the earth was it was a moonscape. There were craters, and the terrain was so messed up, and the earth had been exhumed. It had been vandalized. And we had these so-called black diggers, kind of grave diggers. This is another phenomenon that my colleague Jan Gross has written about as well. After the Holocaust, these communities, these Ukrainian communities, Polish communities, knew exactly where the Jews were killed, knew exactly where they were buried, knew that they brought valuables with them to their deaths, their most precious valuables, including their wedding rings and photographs as well, and Bibles. And they would go into these, disinter these grave sites and plunder them. Also animals, once those were disrupted, you have animals feeding off of them. We have displacement of the soil because of the human remains and the decomposition of the bones and all of these things that change the landscape and transform the landscape. And so there's a history of those places that's important, not only for detection, but as far as what we human beings do to the terrain in these genocidal campaigns. And so we went back, and I was with the French team, I was with a film crew, and we were standing there, and it was raining. So there was the sound of the rain that was very gentle on the leaves, and it was quiet and still. And we went to the ground and just started to move the ground a little bit, like with our feet, with our hands, and saw white remains, and reached down, and there we could see skull fragments and vertebrae fragments, because when the Soviets investigated this in the late 80s, they completely wanted to get the evidence of the victims, and they brought in bulldozers and heavy equipment and big trucks and just completely destroyed that site and brought those bones up to the surface. And they're still there. And it was in 2016. And I immediately we called the rabbi in Strasbourg. It was.
And of course, that doesn't only violate
Jewish.
It doesn't only violate Jewish tradition, it violates humanity, which is that, as you write in the book, the dead should not be disturbed. They deserve to lay in peace. The other thing I found striking on your search here, so now that you've found the location, but you also describe searching for the killers. And one of the things you say is that it was conceivable, very much so, that if you were 20 in 1945, you could still be around 100 years later and alive, or you could still be around 75 years later and alive. You could be about 100 years old or so in the mid 2010s. So how did that fact that these folks could still be alive change your search, and also change the weight on your shoulders that you had to handle this in a certain way because of the responsibilities that you had?
Right. I definitely wanted to find the killers, and the picture is so incriminating. If you showed that, right, to a suspect, right, if you were able to identify that person from the record and so forth. So that was a priority. And the Germans in the photo, as it turned out, were not regular order police, were not SS. Another discovery, they were regular customs guards. Their task in this little town was to check packages at the railway station. This was not what they were trained to do. But the community of Jews in Mariupol at that time, about 1,000 Jews, it was a small town, and the Nazis didn't set up headquarters there. They had a headquarters in a neighboring town. And the SS did come in on that day, the day before the massacre, and went to the local canteen where these customs officials were playing skat, this German card game, and just said, we need to take care of the Jews in this community. We have this action we want to plan. Who wants to volunteer? Who wants to shoot Jews tomorrow? And these two guys I identified, Voigt and Kuska, they stood up, Jawohl. Hey, we want to participate in this. They were known among their colleagues as being extreme anti-Semites and had violent tendencies and so forth. But this doesn't come out until 1969. I found out that based on studying the uniforms, I studied these in the photo. You can see where the badges are on the German uniforms, the buttons on the coat, the sleeve markings. And I determined that they weren't SS, they weren't regular army, they were another kind of uniformed unit. In fact, these were the customs guards, but they had been denounced by another customs guard, a member of that unit in 1969. And those documents were fascinating because the way it appears in the book and what I found out was this, one of the former comrades of the killers, German killers, walks into a small police station in January 1969 in his hometown and says to the official on duty, the intake kind of officer there who fills out forms, he says, I want to report a crime that occurred in 1941 against Jews who were in Ukraine. So it just was, to me, extraordinary that someone could just walk into a police station and say, I'd like to report a crime that happened, decades earlier. And that was key to uncovering the identities of the German killers.
And just tell us where they were at when you discovered who they were.
They were in West Germany, outside of Hanover and near Bremen. And one of them could not be found, but one of them was interrogated. And he just perjured himself left and right. I had the photograph in front of me. I was reading his responses to his interrogators. And he said, the Germans were there, but we didn't kill. He talked about the Ukrainians as well who were there and tried to blame it on the Ukrainians. And they had thick descriptions, vivid descriptions of the massacre itself. And the other testimony in there describing the singing, that the Ukrainians were dancing around singing the Todeslied, the funeral march. So that there were good details in those German interrogations, but filled with denials and lies about who actually did the killing.
And what is the fate of those two? Where, well,
they were never prosecuted, those German killers in the photograph.
And so they just got away with it. Unbelievable. Talk about your search for the photographer. What clues did you have as to who might have taken this picture, and what were his motives that you later find out for why he took the picture? And also, how does the picture become a turning point for him?
Yes, the story of the photographer was the biggest surprise for me because, as I mentioned before, the image is so stable and vivid. It seems to be taken in the open, not clandestinely, not through the seam of a coat. There's no obstruction, right? And so we have the journalists who brought this to me in 2009 from the Czech Republic. They had the name of the photographer as well, because he had been interrogated at least 3 times about these photographs because they were so incriminating. He was interrogated in 1943 in Bratislava by the kind of Slovakian Gestapo office, in 1958, and again in 1959. This photographer turned out to be a really decent guy, right? So the darkness of this photo, the horror of this photo, the depressing nature of it, everything, any way you want to describe it, grim, shocking. And then there's this photographer, and he turns out to be this shining light. He joins the resistance. He rescues Jews, hides them in the attic, goes back to his home in Slovakia, refuses to carry on with the war anymore, pretends to be sick, goes back during Christmas time, and is able to avoid a redeployment further into Russia and towards Stalingrad. So he was in a security guard unit, Slovakian security guard, and so he gets a reprieve there. He's able to stay back home in Slovakia. His hometown is Banská Bystrica. He pretends that he's very sick and mentally incapacitated, and his wife is visiting him at this asylum, and they're playing this, pretending all of this while he's hiding these photographs. He then shows the photographs to Jews in his community saying, do not go to when you're being called to be deported to the East. This is what's going to happen to you. We have to resist this. One of the Jews he rescues is a obstetrician gynecologist, and he actually delivers his son into the world in 1943 in their house. So the photographer, that photo, which looked like he was a collaborator, he was complicit, was his turning point, was his enough moment. He's a young man in his 20s. This was not the war he signed up for. In fact, he didn't even want to put on a uniform. He was not that kind of person. He didn't belong to any political parties. He considered himself apolitical. He loved photography. I met his family. They had these wonderful stories about him. He liked to draw beautiful pictures, and he liked to dance and have parties. And, so this really just destroyed him in many ways. He didn't tell his children, didn't share these photographs with his children, didn't tell them the horrors that he had witnessed, but they knew that he was haunted by this history, that this war was still with him, that he had what we would probably call today a post-traumatic kind of stress disorder. Like, this was part of their story too. But he became a resistor because of this, because of what he witnessed.
What were you able to find out about this poor family? You got tantalizingly close. I was rooting for you as I was reading this book. I was like, come on, one more clue. Maybe even before you answer that, you do notice that there is a second child in the picture, and I didn't notice it at first, and I don't think you did either, at least the way it sounded in the book. Just tell us about noticing that second child and how that helps you start to go on this journey of figuring out who these poor victims were.
Well, with the advantages we have now of different technologies and zooming in and zooming out and digital imagery, that helped a lot. That's also part of the story, as far as what I mentioned before, the different methods and tools that we have available to us to discover that we need to employ and take advantage of. So I was able to, with my tech folks, kind of zoom in and zoom out on this. I also, the photograph was displayed in an exhibit at the museum, a temporary exhibit, and they had a very large, they blew it up and it was, on the wall. And I studied it in that form as well. I actually was observing visitors at the museum while they were looking at it too. That was interesting. And so at one point I started to look and I realized that the woman was standing in a kind of perpendicular position. She wasn't kind of buckling under the weight of the blast of the gun. She wasn't kind of falling on her knees, but she was standing kind of in a stiff posture, and that there was something in front of her, and that there was light passing through kind of on her lap, in between her legs. And then I looked and I realized that I was seeing the contours of another child, of like a little behind and some legs, and the child was on her lap in the front of her, and she was trying to like hold it or protect it. And I could see a little scarf. And then there is another photograph, because our photographer took 5 photographs that day. As I dug into his story, I found more photographs from that day. He had a camera, that portable camera he had, that Zeiss Icon, the film roll he had could take 7 pictures. So getting the technical side of the camera. And so we found 5 altogether. And this one is the central image. But by looking at the other images, he took a picture at the end from above, looking down into the pit. And when you zoom in on that, and you see the tangle of corpses and bodies in the pit, you can actually see this woman's polka dot dress. She's still holding the hand of the little boy, and there's another child. So then I realized that there was a woman, approximately, a middle-aged woman, a child probably born, between 35 and 39, and then another child maybe born in the earlier part. So I was starting to construct a kind of family unit that then brought me into the world of genealogical research, which I conducted at Yad Vashem. And that was the kind of memorial work, as far as research work, of recreating those family trees that had been completely, cut down by the Nazis. And figuring out based on lists of victims. We only had about 460 victims who could be identified after the war by name in family units. That's half of the victims in the town, right? So it's really a needle in a haystack. Half of the victims in Ukraine, mostly children, have not been identified. I mean, we have wonderful databases of Jewish family genealogy and victims' names, and that community that has put that together is fantastic. And we read their names out during Holocaust Remembrance Week, like last week, and in April here we have Days of Remembrance, and we have the impression that we know these victims by name. We can mention them, like Anne Frank, for instance, but in fact, they're not all identified. And in the end, I was able to identify a cousin of potentially a relative of the little boy. But the woman who submitted this page of testimony, Yad Vashem, about her Jewish relatives who were killed in Mirapol in the park in October 1941, like everything started to come together there. But when I interviewed her in Southfield, Michigan, and she was not in Mirapol during the war, she'd been evacuated with the Red Army and had left, she couldn't identify it. I mean, their faces are obscured in the smoke. We don't see them head on. I found another family photograph of victims, a family that had been killed in that same massacre. But and it looked like them. And if you buy the book, you'll see that image of that family photograph. You'll see that little boy's face looking at you, as opposed to in the atrocity image, you see the back of his head, and it looks like the same exact boy. And in fact, the woman I spoke to in Michigan, in her family photo album that she showed me, her relatives were wearing, her mother was wearing a polka dotted dress, the same material that this woman has on, right? So it seemed like I was really close, but I couldn't get a positive identification. And of course, there was no way I was going to misidentify the victims.
You've got a book here, which is satisfying, I'm sure, personally, to at least have that. But in yourself, did you find satisfaction in what your search turned up? Did you feel that you were able to bring closure to these victims? Did you feel you were able to bring them some sort of a measure of justice by deeply reporting this moment, this photograph of their demise?
I don't think, well, as a researcher, you have a sense of accomplishment or achievement when you do figure certain things out, like the killers and the photographer and the stories that I uncovered in the process. And that feels good. That's, those are moments, kind of aha moments, and moments you have a sense of closure because you feel confident that that's who that person is and that's what happened. And not being able to precisely identify the victims was really frustrating. I so wanted that, and I so wanted to deliver that to my readers as well. But at some point I had to stand back and accept that ambivalence and accept that reality of genocide, that we're working against erasure, we're working against forgetting, we're working against the passage of time, and that the missing, which is one of the chapters in the book, is this other reality. We can't kind of take comfort or kind of somehow be satisfied or placated by the identifying a portion. It's the fact is that many have never been registered as missing. And that's the part of genocide that I think we often forget, that there are so many who are not registered. No family members could register them. So where do you start? And you kind of work around with one source like this. I was happy to actually, if I could use the word happy, I was delighted when I saw that other photograph of that family at Yad Vashem, because first of all, I thought it could be them. And that was an amazing moment. But then it was another family. And then I realized, well, if I hadn't conducted this research for this family, I wouldn't have found this other family, or I wouldn't have been able to speak to this survivor, or I wouldn't have pieced together the history of Mirapol and the Jews there, or worked on the other survivor testimony to really show in vivid detail what happened, to talk to those Ukrainian witnesses And as painful as those stories were for them to retell, to get that on record, right? To get on record that those Germans got away with it, to get on record that the Ukrainians didn't. And to also go to that site and establish that this site needs to be protected. This is what happened. This is reality in a real material sense as far as what's there and what remains. So there were achievements, there were discoveries. And the fact that I didn't identify the Jewish family or wasn't willing to make that leap with as far as I got, it's not closure, but is genocide, the history of genocide, is the Holocaust supposed to be closure? No, it's this continual search and discovery, and the material resources to do so are vast, and the source material is vast, and that's what I do.
One of the points you make in the book is that the survival of the Jewish family is a way of defeating the Nazis again and again. Can you describe what you mean by that?
Well, the survival of the Jewish family is not only the continuity of Jewish life and existence, thousands of years of existence of incredible cultural development, learning, contributions to society, everything that is Jewish history, that is our history, global history, and all that we can learn from that. So, to celebrate that and to learn from that is how we resist genocide, how we work against it as scholars and as human beings. And to, in the course of this book, for instance, even learning more about Jewish burial practices and traditions, and the Dybbuk, this Yiddish Yiddish story, this play that originated in this town, to recapture that culture and that life while I was dealing with such a photograph, it's just kind of that working against this remnant. In the beginning of the book, I mentioned wanting to kind of blow out the frame of the photograph, that to not have that image of that family be the one that remains, but to try to tell the story of what happened before, what's going on in the picture, what happened afterwards, what was lost besides these families in those places is what really motivates this work, and I think is the kind of ethical, historical agenda there.
Genocide, and this is kind of the billion-dollar question. This is why we're doing this episode, and why I would assume that most historians of the Holocaust continue to study it and argue it's so important we all learn from it. The question is, if genocide is essentially regulated and legal homicide, how do we stop that from happening again? And then the 1B question is, how long is the distance between a free society and a society that decides the so-called outsiders, A, first who they are, and B, that they must be violently removed? What are the warning signs? How do we stop this from happening again?
There are so many warning signs, and I think we tend not to look them up, sometimes not to add them up. And we are also concerned often in this day to jump to conclusions. I see there's often a reluctance to use the word genocide or even ethnic cleansing when we have violent conflict emerging, like right now in Azerbaijan, or what's the Boko Haram now seems to be back at work as well. Or when we look at regions where there have been cycles of violence, whether it's Rwanda or in the Congo, to just monitor these things very closely, because they can occur over a kind of long durée, over generations, or they can become very violent. They can escalate very quickly and kind of explode in a way, and then you have to respond to that. So it's something that requires paying attention and carefully watching. But it starts with ideas. It starts with our human capacity to hate. As much as we are defined as humans with our capacity to love, we are also pretty skilled at coming up with hateful ideologies. Anti-Semitism, as one book calls it, the longest hatred. And so these ideologies become ever more kind of multifaceted and insidious and multi-pronged. They extend over generations. They seem to operate in places like anti-Semitism where there are no Jews. You can have anti-Semitic hate where there are no Jews residing in those communities, like in the former Eastern Europe, where the Jews were wiped out in places like Mariupol. I encountered anti-Semitism when I interviewed some of my Ukrainian witnesses. So these start with these ideas, and we have to take words very seriously, and hateful rhetoric and incendiary rhetoric, as we have to believe it when we hear it, as not just propaganda or just words. And a lot of it also starts at home. I work a lot on gender violence and gendered history of violence. And there are things that are tolerated in the way we're socialized in our family units and at home that can, whether it's hateful speech, prejudice, violence, domestic abuse, disrespect. I mean, very fundamental ways of behavior at home and in our classrooms. And I think, often we don't stop and put the brakes on that or challenge a colleague or a friend or a neighbor or even a family member. So some of these very fundamental issues are at work in these situations as well to be aware of.
This isn't necessarily a Holocaust-centered question, but I want to ask what we can learn from all the photographs that we see every single day on social media, on the news, on our phones. What can we learn from your reporting on this photograph? You opened up this whole world just from this one snapshot in time that took place 75 years ago. What can we learn about our own lives and all these photographs we're surrounded by when we see them that are other snapshots in time, most of them much happier and much friendlier than what we're talking about today? But what can we learn about the way we record human existence and what we should think about when we see a random picture on social media or something like that?
Well, we have to develop a literacy in a way, an eye, as far as the eye of the observer and keen observation, and what that entails in the way that we are critical readers. We have to be critical viewers. We are flooded with imagery. Sometimes we're not quite sure how authentic it is, if it's been touched up or airbrushed or what have you. So they can be easily manipulated, and we have to be able to detect that. On the other hand, some of the imagery, some would argue, oh, you're going to become desensitized. There's so much violent imagery out there that we're not going to be as empathetic, or we're just not going to care, or our attention spans are so short. And so my book is really trying to argue that, first of all, we have this violent imagery around us, including Holocaust imagery that has become iconic and is blown up and displayed in museums and is on Wikipedia and all kinds of websites all over. Let's take a look at that. Let's question that and be aware of its prevalence, but take on the responsibility of trying to figure out what's in that picture, what the context is, who, what, where, when, not just think of it as kind of public domain, it's out there, but understand it as a source, as something to be studied and researched, because these images put a lot of things in motion, sometimes more than the written word, because of the visual world we live in. I mean, that image of that little boy who washed up on the Bodrum beach, right? A little boy in a little red T-shirt, which kind of propelled a change of policy in Germany and Europe as far as immigration. It became iconic. Or we have images from Vietnam that also trigger certain kind of understanding. But those images can't be stand-ins for history, right? They can't just be out there like the image of the gates leading to Auschwitz-Birkenau, right? People know that image, but then if you ask a young person, what is that? They might say Auschwitz if most young people don't really know the word or know what was really going on there. So if we're going to live in this world of imagery, we have to figure out what those 1,000 words are that that image is telling us, and not be too complacent about the proliferation of them, but seek to study them, and you will discover a lot as I do with this image.
What would you say to the victims in the picture we're talking about today if they could hear you right now?
Oh. Well,
It's a tough question. I'm sitting here thinking myself.
it is a
what I would
tough
say.
it's a tough question, and as I've engaged in this over the years, I've certainly in my mind had kinds of conversations, right? And kinds of thoughts about the victims and my connection to them in this work. I guess it's, we now we know what happened. We see what happened to you. We know what happened to you. It's not a mystery. You didn't die in vain. Your lives were cut short. This was wrong. And in some ways we're sorry.
Yeah, that's the word that I would sum up my thoughts. Of course you would say more, but my thoughts would just be, I'm really sorry the world couldn't protect you.
Yes.
Really sorry that, sorry sounds ridiculous when you think about what happened, but that would be the basis of a hopefully more eloquent and longer explanation of my feelings to them. But anyway, Dr. Wendy Lower, the author of The Ravine, A Family, a Photograph, a Holocaust Massacre Revealed. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Certainly check out that book and also her previous book published in 2013, Hitler's Furies, German Women in the Nazi Killing Fields, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. I do want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History, and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Be sure to check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.